The night we agreed to the swap, the air between us felt too calm, too rehearsed, like actors who had memorized their lines but forgotten why the story mattered. And I remember watching my husband Ethan laugh across the dinner table with Claire and Mark, our longtime friends. The four of us pretending this was spontaneous, pretending it was adventurous, pretending it wasn't something carefully arranged weeks in advance, because the truth was that the swap had never been about desire. Not really. It had been about doubt. About suspicion that had grown quietly in my chest for months, as I noticed the late messages, the subtle distance, the way Ethan's compliments toward Claire lingered just a second too long, and when he casually suggested the idea of testing boundaries in our marriages as a way to prove trust. I had smiled as though intrigued while something colder formed beneath my ribs. Claire had agreed too quickly, Mark had hesitated just long enough to seem noble, and I had studied them all carefully, because what none of them knew was that I had already spoken to Mark privately 2 weeks earlier, after finding a receipt in Ethan's jacket from a hotel neither of us had ever visited together, and Mark had confessed what he suspected, that Ethan and Claire were already involved, and the swap was not an experiment, but a cover, a performance designed to legitimize what had likely begun in secret. So we made our own plan inside their plan, Mark and I, quiet and strategic, agreeing to go along with it, to observe, to gather proof, not just of infidelity, but of intent. Because betrayal born from impulse is different from betrayal born from calculation, and this felt calculated. The evening unfolded exactly as Ethan must have imagined. Wine flowing, nervous laughter disguising tension, and when the moment came for the couples to separate for the night, he squeezed my hand with a confidence that felt almost triumphant, as though he believed he had orchestrated everything perfectly, and I let him believe it. Because sometimes the most powerful position is the one where you appear unaware. Mark and I did not cross the lines they expected. Instead, we talked, quietly and honestly, about the cracks in our marriages, about the signs we had both ignored, about the careful choreography Ethan and Claire must have thought invisible. And in that conversation, the final pieces aligned, confirming what we had already begun to understand. The swap was never a test of trust between spouses. It was meant to ease guilt between lovers. But here was the twist they never saw coming. The swap was planned as a test, just not the one they thought. Because while Ethan believed he was normalizing his affair, I was documenting it. Messages synced to a hidden backup, timelines aligned, witnesses present, and by morning the illusion he had constructed began to collapse. When we all gathered again for breakfast, the tension felt different, sharper, and Ethan looked at me with a question in his eyes, as though sensing something had shifted. And I calmly placed my phone on the table, screen lit with a thread of messages between him and Claire that predated their so-called experiment by months. Messages neither of them had known I'd access to a shared tablet they forgot was still linked, and silence swallowed the room. Claire's face drained of color, Mark didn't look surprised, and Ethan's confidence cracked in a way I had never witnessed before, because for the first time he was not controlling the narrative. I didn't scream, didn't accuse, didn't dramatize. I simply explained that the swap had indeed been a test, and they had both failed long before the night began. And what they mistook for permission had actually been exposure. The real betrayal wasn't the idea of swapping partners. It was the months of deception disguised as curiosity, the manipulation disguised as honesty. And as I stood to leave, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't heartbroken. I was clear, because sometimes the most devastating endings are also the cleanest. Ethan tried to follow me outside, tried to frame it as misunderstanding, as mutual exploration gone wrong, but the evidence spoke louder than his excuses. And I told him that trust is not proven by daring someone to lose you. It is proven by choosing them when no one is watching. And he had already made his choice. The swap had been planned as a test, yes, but not of loyalty in the way he imagined. It tested character, and character reveals itself when people think they are getting away with something. By the time I Maver Aitson felt too hot for my own body, like the hallway was stretching away rare tunnel thing, but because of months of hidden decisions. And as I drove away, I understood that sometimes you don't need revenge. You only need the truth placed carefully in the light. Because once exposed, it rearranges everything. And the people who thought they were in control suddenly realized they were the ones being measured all along. The fallout did not explode the way I once imagined betrayal would. It unfolded slowly, like a controlled demolition where the structure looks intact, even as the foundation gives way. And in the days after the breakfast confrontation, Ethan moved through the house with the careful quiet of someone stepping around broken glass, choosing his words too precisely, offering apologies that sounded polished rather than raw, and I realized he still believed this was salvageable. still believed that because the swap had technically been consensual, he could blur the timeline enough to make the past indistinct. But what he didn't understand was that my clarity had hardened into something immovable, because once you see manipulation clearly, you cannot unsee it. And every gesture he made now only revealed how calculated he had always been. Mark filed for separation within the week, and Claire sent me a message that with half apology, half justification, claiming that feelings had developed unexpectedly, that she never meant for it to spiral, that the swap was supposed to make everything honest, and I read her words carefully, noticing how she framed herself as carried by emotion rather than driven by choice. And it struck me that the most dangerous lies are the ones people tell themselves first. Ethan, meanwhile, attempted reinvention. He cooked dinners he had never cooked before, suggested therapy he had once dismissed, even offered full transparency with his devices as though openness after exposure could retroactively create integrity. And for a moment I almost pitied him, because he looked less like a mastermind and more like a man stunned by consequences. But pity is not the same as trust, and trust, once fractured by design rather than accident, does not regenerate on command. One evening, as rain pressed softly against the windows, he finally dropped the rehearsed calm and asked the question that had clearly been circling in his mind. "When did you know?" And I told him the truth, that I had suspected long before the swap, that the swap itself confirmed what had already been broken, and his face shifted in a way that revealed more than any confession, because beneath his surprise was disappointment, not that he had hurt me, but that he had been outmaneuvered. That was the moment I understood something crucial. The swap had not only been a cover for an affair, it had been a control mechanism, a way for him to orchestrate the narrative so that no matter what surfaced later, he could say we had both agreed to unconventional boundaries, that no betrayal truly existed because consent had been staged. What he hadn't anticipated was that consent without full truth is just another form of deception. The legal unraveling began quietly after that. Assets divided, statements drafted, timelines clarified, and with each document signed, the illusion of our marriage thinned until it felt like a story we once told rather than a life we had lived. Friends reacted in predictable patterns, some choosing neutrality, others quietly taking sides, and I learned quickly who valued truth over comfort, because it is easier to believe that marriages dissolve from mutual drift than from deliberate manipulation. Through it all, I remained calmer than I expected. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because the hurt had already happened months before, in small increments, in lonely suspicions and sleepless nights. And what remained now was simply the administrative closure of something that had ended long ago. The real twist, I realized, was not that the swap exposed an affair, but that it exposed character. And character, once revealed, rewrites every memory preceding it. Even moments I once cherished now appeared staged, as though he had always been capable of compartmentalizing affection. And I began to question how much of our history had been genuine and how much had been performance. And yet, amid that disorientation, something steady grew inside me, a quiet confidence that I had not only uncovered the truth, but orchestrated its reveal on my own terms. Because the swap may have been his idea, but the exposure had been mine. Months later, when the divorce was finalized, and the dust of scandal settled into something resembling routine, I ran into Mark at a cafe, and we spoke not as co-conspirators, but as survivors of the same illusion. And he admitted that if the swap had never happened, he might still be doubting himself, still wondering whether his suspicions were paranoia rather than instinct. And I understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes a test is necessary not to trap someone, but to free yourself from uncertainty. As I walked home that afternoon, the city humming with indifferent life around me, I felt neither victorious nor defeated. Only clear and clarity, I had learned, is the sharpest form of peace. The swap was planned as a test, yes, but in the end, it tested something larger than loyalty between partners. It tested self-respect, boundaries, and the courage to confront what you already suspect. And while Ethan and Claire had entered that night believing they were controlling the experiment, they had unknowingly stepped into a mirror, one that reflected not desire or adventure, but the truth of who they were when they thought no one was really looking. In the weeks that followed, the narrative outside our small circle began to mutate, reshaped by whispers and selective retellings, because scandal rarely survives in its original form once it passes through enough mouths. And I quickly learned that some people preferred the version where all four of us had simply been reckless adults experimenting with boundaries, rather than the less comfortable truth that two of them had engineered the situation to sanitize an affair already in progress. Ethan leaned into that ambiguity at first, telling mutual friends that we all agreed, and that lines just got blurry. as though betrayal were a shared miscalculation instead of a private choice. And I could see how appealing that framing was, how it softened his culpability and redistributed it across the group. But I no longer felt compelled to protect his image, and when asked directly, I told the timeline plainly, without embellishment or fury, just facts arranged in order, because facts are difficult to argue with when they are calm. Claire, on the other hand, retreated into silence, deactivating accounts, avoiding gatherings, and for a brief moment I wondered if guilt had finally found her. But Mark later told me she had simply relocated the story among her own friends, presenting herself as someone who had fallen unexpectedly in love, as though emotion were an unstoppable tide rather than a door she opened willingly. It fascinated me, the human instinct to rewrite intention once consequence arrives, and I realized that the true psychological aftermath of the swap wasn't the divorce paperwork or the divided assets. It was watching how each person chose to interpret themselves in the mirror of exposure. Ethan requested one final conversation before the court date, not to reconcile, but to understand, and we met in a quiet park where the neutrality of the setting felt almost clinical, and he asked if there had ever been a moment where I would have forgiven him if he had confessed before the swap, and I answered honestly that perhaps I could have forgiven infidelity born from weakness, but I could not forgive manipulation born from strategy, because the swap had not been an accident. It had been architecture, designed to protect him while destabilizing me, and that difference mattered. He seemed to absorb that slowly, as though only now grasping the magnitude of what he had done, and I noticed something almost childlike in his confusion, the shock of someone discovering that cleverness is not the same as wisdom. What neither of them anticipated was the ripple effect the truth would create beyond our marriages. Mutual friends began reevaluating their own relationships, small doubts surfacing where blind trust once lived, and I received messages from two women who admitted that watching how calmly I handled the exposure made them confront patterns they had been ignoring in their own homes. That, more than anything, shifted my understanding of the event, because the swap was no longer just a private implosion. It had become a quiet cautionary tale about the difference between consensual exploration and coerced narrative. Months later, at a gathering I almost declined to attend, I found myself in the same room as Claire for the first time since everything unraveled, and the air between us was not charged with hostility, but with something more complex, recognition perhaps, of shared consequence if not shared accountability, and she approached me with a composure that felt rehearsed, saying she never intended to hurt me, that she thought the swap would make everything simpler, and I realized then that simplicity had been the illusion they were both chasing. The idea that if everyone signed off on the surface arrangement, the underlying betrayal would dissolve. But human trust does not function like a contract amendment. It is not retroactively adjustable. I told her I no longer carried anger, only clarity, and that clarity required distance, and she nodded in a way that suggested she finally understood that the damage had never been about one night, but about months of concealed alignment. Walking home afterward, I reflected on how easily the entire scenario could have been framed as mutual experimentation gone wrong, and how tempting it would have been for me to accept that diluted version just to avoid the discomfort of confrontation. But the deeper truth was that the swap tested not only fidelity but perception, and perception is where manipulation thrives. By the time my legal proceedings concluded and the dust settled into new routines, I no longer thought of myself as someone who had been wronged in a sensational way. Instead, I saw myself as someone who had stepped deliberately into a trap, knowing it was there, and turned on the light before it could close. The real twist was never the affair itself, nor even the orchestrated cover, but the quiet reversal of power that occurred the moment I decided to observe instead of react, to document instead of deny, and to expose without theatrics. In the end, the swap was indeed a planned test, but it measured something far more revealing than attraction or jealousy. It measured integrity under the illusion of permission, and when that illusion dissolved, what remained was not chaos but truth, and truth, once seen clearly, does not require noise to be definitive. A year later, the story no longer felt like a scandal, but like a case study in human nature, and I sometimes caught myself replaying that night not with bitterness, but with analytical distance, examining each glance, each pause, each carefully chosen word as though it were evidence and a broader experiment about trust and control. Ethan eventually moved in with Claire, a decision that surprised no one, and yet confirmed everything, because what had once been hidden now needed the legitimacy of permanence to justify the wreckage it caused, and I wondered privately whether relationships born in secrecy ever stopped glancing over their shoulders. Mark and I remained loosely connected, not bound by trauma, but by understanding, the kind that forms when two people witness the same fracture from opposite sides. And we occasionally spoke about how easy it would have been to stay silent, to let the ambiguity protect everyone's pride. That silence, I realized, had been the real danger all along. The swap itself faded into anecdote among acquaintances who preferred the more sensational angle, but for me it remained something far more precise, a controlled exposure. I had entered that night already aware of the fault lines, already sensing the imbalance in Ethan's tone whenever Claire's name surfaced, already cataloging inconsistencies that intuition flagged long before proof arrived. And what the swap did was accelerate revelation, compress months of suspicion into a single undeniable timeline. When people later asked if I regretted agreeing to it, I surprised myself by saying no, because without it, I might still be negotiating half-truths, still doubting my instincts, still allowing clever explanations to override quiet evidence. The experiment they believed would normalize betrayal instead magnified it. The final conversation I ever had with Ethan was unexpectedly brief. We crossed paths during a property appraisal, paperwork nearly complete, and he remarked that he never thought I would be the one to end things so decisively. And there was no accusation in his voice, only a lingering disbelief that the dynamic had shifted so completely. I told him something I had only recently understood myself, that the swap didn't change who I was. It revealed who I had always been when pushed far enough. He nodded, perhaps recognizing that his miscalculation had never been underestimating my tolerance, but underestimating my threshold. And that was the true twist that no one outside the four of us fully grasped. The swap was planned as a test, yes, but not of open-mindedness or modern boundaries or adventurous trust. It was a test of whether deception could survive in daylight. Ethan and Claire assumed consent would blur culpability, that shared participation would dissolve private wrongdoing, but they forgot that transparency without chronology is manipulation. And once the timeline was laid bare, their narrative collapsed under its own design. What I carried forward from it all was not cynicism but discernment, a sharpened ability to differentiate between invitation and orchestration, between mutual risk and engineered permission. In quiet moments now, when I think about how close I came to accepting their framing of events, I feel a quiet gratitude for the part of me that paused instead of panicked, that observed instead of exploded, because restraint gave me leverage, and leverage gave me truth. The marriages ended not because of one experimental night, but because that night illuminated what had already been decaying beneath polished surfaces. And as life rebuilt itself into something calmer, steadier, less performative, I understood the final irony. They believed they were testing loyalty between partners, but what was truly tested was self-respect, and in that measure I passed. The swap was planned as a test, and in the end it succeeded, just not for the reasons they intended, and not for the people who thought they were conducting it.